Good morning and welcome to Ask the Expert. I'm Joe Taylor. This morning, another in the ongoing series of programs presented by the Northwest Regional Key Program for Quality Early Learning. The program, through the Northwest Institute of Research, oversees a grant from the Office of Child Development and Early Learning at the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services and the Department of Education. The goal of the program is to improve the outcomes for young children as they prepare for school. John Poza from the Pennsylvania Key is the host of the program and is with us throughout the series. Well, good morning, John. Glad to see you again. And who do we have on the show this morning?
Good morning, Joe. This morning we have Ellen Abramson, who has been supporting young children with and without disabilities and their families and adults who work with them for over 30 years at the local, state, and national level. She works in government, public and private schools, childcare, hospitals, and community programs. Ellen teaches at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, as well as the College of Southern Maryland, and has provided training workshops nationwide to parents, educators, and child-serving professionals on a variety of brain-based topics, including understanding ADHD, executive function skills, and bullying. Welcome to the program, Ellen.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. And of course, I just wanted to say at the outside, I had the pleasure of hearing Ellen and meeting Ellen at a recent workshop she presented not too far from where we're recording in Titusville, Pennsylvania, at the middle school. And she presented on the topic of right from the start, building great brains from birth to age 5. And they are very, very good lessons for parents and actually for all folks who work with children at a young age. And Ellen, I wanted to talk to you right from the get-go. Let's just, right from the start, how did you get involved initially in the work that you do and make a career out of it?
Well, I originally started working with very young children with disabilities, and I worked with families in their homes, helping families deal with it and working with the children. And as I got more and more involved with the families and the children and the issues, and then I got involved with more typically developing peers, and I realized that the brain is so fascinating, and everybody wanted to know why we thought this way, why we did this way. And so then I started studying more about the brain, and that's where I got here.
Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you is that, of course, you know that there are 5 essentials for building great brains, and I know that you list them as safety, nutrition, sensory development, emotional support, and cognitive stimulation. If you could touch on these points initially to give us, especially parents, an understanding of how important these areas are.
Absolutely. When we talk about safety, we talk about both prenatally and postnatally. So for safety, it's critical that that parents know about what could happen to their babies in terms of all the tetrodogens and the smoking, alcohol, drugs, germs, domestic violence, all that stuff. And then we talk about and child abuse, including physical, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. All those things cause major danger to brains of young children. Then we also know that how important nutrition is, because what is good for our bodies is good for our brains, and vice versa. And if we think about it, what goes into our brains, what goes into our mouths, come out of how we think and how we do and why we do what we do. Then we also talk about
sensory development.
Sensory development. So we're looking at the senses that happen at the beginning, the sense of touch, the sense of movement. What we do know is that the more the baby moves, the more the baby learns, and the more the baby learns, the more the baby moves. So we want that to happen. So we look at, and then visual, hearing, touching, smelling, tasting, moving. We all know about cognitive stimulation, but what we don't think about as much is the emotional support. And what we do know is that all the stress that happens in babies' lives can be counteracted by love, caring, and emotional support. So the brain produces cortisol, which when there's a lot of stress, what counteracts that is produced by love and caring and support from caring adults.
And of course, cognitive stimulation.
Cognitive support is what we all know, which is we have to keep the brain busy. We used to believe that we waited to deal with cognitive and intellectual and academic stuff when kids were school age. And now we know that all that learning happens right from the start.
Obviously, with the safety issue, there are certain prenatal influences on safety. For instance, the central nervous system is the most sensitive to prenatal influences. And why is that the case?
Well, when in utero, the central nervous system is critical. That's what determines what happens with the rest of your body. And what's interesting about prenatally is that things depend upon when you do things, like if you're taking drugs or something like that, or there's violence or stress situation, when it's happening, at what time, what point in your gestational process it's happening, and your central nervous system is involved in kind of executing all that.
Can I ask you a question as far as all of these negative situations before a baby is born? How then do they manifest themselves once the child is born and, let's say, gets to be 2, 3, 4 years old?
So that's an interesting question that I wish I could answer quickly. But everything impacts the child differently. For example, if you drank too much alcohol, then the baby could be born with fetal alcohol syndrome or fetal alcohol effects. And what that means is that the alcohol affects every single cell in your body. So therefore, babies that are born with fetal alcohol syndrome tend to be hyperactive, often have limited cognitive intelligence, tend to not make appropriate decisions. So that kind of thing affects everything. If you take, for example, an opiate like heroin, babies are born addicted, which means their little bodies have to go through withdrawal. So all the things that you know about adults going through withdrawal of drugs, little babies do that. And so that sometimes babies don't even make it through that process because it is so powerful to their bodies and their brains. There are other drugs. So some drugs are water soluble, and when they're born, the drug leaves their system. So, for example, the opiates, after the babies go through withdrawal, then they don't have the heroin in their system anymore. So they'll always kind of be in recovering, but they don't have it in the system. But other drugs, for example, like PCP, they're in their system forever. They're in the system of the fat cells of the body. So those kids can be emotionally liable. 1 second they're happy, they're in a great mood. The next second, all of a sudden, they have a feat of rage, and you have no idea where that came from. So everything affects babies differently. Cocaine and smoking decreases the size of your blood vessels, so that decreases the amount of blood that's going to the brain. The more blood that goes to the brain, the more powerful, the more efficient the brain can work. So the less blood is not that good. Nutrition can determine the size of the brain, can determine what's going on. Now, some of these things, what's so amazing about our brain is that it's what we call plastic, which means that it really, even though sometimes we look at dire things happening to young brains, brains can change, and we can really make a difference.
Absolutely. Postnatally, there are many influences on the safety of a child, and some of those child abuse and poverty are things that obviously affect the development of a child. And just to clarify, there is a difference between what we refer to as child abuse and child neglect, two completely different things. And you may want to touch on the difference between the two so that people working with children can recognize the signs of either.
Right. So what we know about in terms of child abuse, physical abuse, everybody knows what that is. Everybody knows about sexual abuse. Emotional abuse is actually more subtle, but even just isolating kids, berating kids. All that has impact in developing brains. So any kind of abuse can either be severe or mild, and any kind of abuse can be worse than the other. It's not like physical is worse than sexual is worse than emotional. Now, neglect, which is the largest, most common form of abuse, it's 90% more times common, 90 times more common, neglect than either physical, emotional, or sexual abuse.
Can you give us a definition of what you mean by neglect? I mean, when you say neglect, immediately I think about, okay, the kid is home alone, there's no parent. Obviously, that would be one aspect, but what are some of the other aspects of a child being neglected by a parent?
So neglect is neglecting the physical needs such as nutrition, clothing, shelter, health care, dental care, avoidable hazards, proper supervision. Then it also includes cognitive needs such as sensory stimulation, touch, verbal exposure, educational support, and advocacy. For cognitive needs, just because we take care of a baby and make sure they get enough food, but if people are not talking to their kids, if they're not playing with their children, if they're not touching their children, then the brains are affected and the brains are not going to grow as well. And then we also talk about neglect is not meeting emotional needs either. The emotional needs, such as nurturing and affection, psychological care when needed, and exposure to domestic violence. All those things have an impact on developing brains.
In terms of sensory development, Ellen, I know that you often talk about this, is that a baby's first toy is your face. And that is actually the truth, is it not, in terms of how you communicate and work with a young baby?
Absolutely. And when we think about it, what is more important, having a baby be able to interact with people and faces, or having a baby interact with things? So if people don't have a lot of money, and even if they do, I'd much rather them be playing with faces and people than toys and things. And babies love faces because, when they come out of the womb, they don't really see lots of colors, especially light blue and pink. I'm not sure that we ever use those because babies can't even see those. They see contrast. So what's really cool about faces is that we have the eyes and the nose and the mouth on a face, and those are very contrasted, and kids get excited about them, and they learn quickly what different facial expressions mean. And having kids be able to read social cues is critically important. If we have done studies in which they take moms and they have them interact with their babies, and they're smiling and the babies are cooing, and then they have them keep a still face. Within 2 minutes of the moms not responding at all, the babies start drooling, flailing their arms and legs, crying, squealing, reaching out, doing all sorts of things to continue the contact with their mom. So they want and they need that so badly. So that touch is critically important. It's critically important also that kids, in terms of sensory development, have the space and the movement to move. Our brains work better while we're moving, and so if we don't have to say to babies, oh, baby, it's important for you to stand up. They know that already. They want to stand up. They want to see the world in a vertical way, in a horizontal way. So they pull to stand. They jump on you. They do all that. And babies have to be given that opportunity to do that. I've been in homes where there's so much furniture that babies don't have any room to move, and then the parents wonder why they're not crawling and why they're not walking. Touch is so important. There have been studies of babies in institutions, and if there is no touch, those babies will die quicker, even if they're getting fed, even if their physical needs are taken care of.
Yeah, there were so many stories of Eastern European children, I think Romanian especially,
Romania,
who were in
absolutely.
orphanages, and then American parents adopted them, and they bought themselves really probably a lifetime of trouble for parents and also for the children. I'm going way off course here, but I wonder with those babies, do you know how did they turn out okay, or did anyone follow them? And you any kind of study on that? Do you
Well,
know?
that's really interesting because some things have to happen at certain ages in babies' lives. So, for example, they have to be touched and loved and cared for from birth to 5 years old. 90% of the brain is developed by the time you're 5 years old. And so that if the babies were not touched and cuddled and emotionally cared for under the age of 5, the chances that they will be able to live a successful life, even if they get the love and the caring and everything after 5, is not great. And so the thing about it is that if anybody's thinking about adopting kids, you want to adopt them as early as possible. So if they've had a tough birth to 1, they've had a tough 1 to 2, but if you can get them under 5 and you can provide all that support, sometimes you can impact positively what happened before. But if you wait and get a child who's like 6 or 7 or 10 or 12, it's really, really hard to overcome that love and that sensory deprivation that they've had when they were younger. So in following up kids, what we found is that if they were adopted older, they died earlier and they did not have a chance to be as successful. They were adopted younger, the youngest they were adopted, then sometimes these babies had a chance to have a fully productive and happy life.
Yeah, and the other thing is that a lot of people may not realize is that even the physical development of a child that's adopted from Eastern Europe, for instance, that were put in orphanages, that physically they may not be grow at the same normal rate as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the brain impacts our physical development, our emotional development, our mental development. And so if brains are not stimulated physically, emotionally, cognitively, then their bodies are going to show that. They're going to have evidence. Now, the plastic brain is pretty exciting about if you take a baby, well, let's say you take a child who at 6 years old, let's say they've been eating well their whole life, and then for 1 year, they don't eat well, they just eat all this junk food, their brain will change. But then, if they start eating really good, high-quality foods, their brains will go back to being a good, efficient, high-quality brain. So there's some things that we can change completely, and we won't have a permanent impact.
Let's talk about cognitive stimulation, Ellen. One of the things that I know you've spoke of, and folks that are in the child development field know of it, but we call it the Great Marshmallow Experiment. For our listeners who may not be familiar with that, talk a little bit about what was done in that experiment and what we found out.
So the marshmallow experiment was done by Walter Mischel, and he did it about the first time about 30 years ago. What's fascinating is that experiment has been replicated all around the world in every language on Earth, it seems. If you want to Google marshmallow experiments, you're going to find very exciting things. So what they did was they did it with 4-year-old children. And an experiment said to a 4-year-old child, I am going to give you a marshmallow right now. I need to leave the room for a few minutes. If you don't eat that marshmallow, when I come back, then I will give you 2 marshmallows. Now, if the kids that did not eat the marshmallow in that time, they've studied those kids all the way through adulthood, and they found amazing things just from not eating the marshmallows. In other words, just from delaying gratification. The kinds of things that they saw were that more kids graduated high school, more kids went on to college, more kids end up getting married. The kids that were not able to delay gratification, had to eat that first marshmallow really fast, some of those kids dropped out of high school, became alcoholics, had a baby at a young age, all those things. It's so fascinating. The kids that waited for that second marshmallow got 200 more points on their SATs. So the important thing to know about this experiment is not the marshmallow, because Walter Marshall has since written a book called Beyond Marshmallows, and he wants everybody to know the marshmallow wasn't the important thing. The important thing was delaying gratification.
Right.
So the kids that couldn't delay gratification, it doesn't mean they're sentenced to the rest of their life as, not having a good life. It tells us that we can teach the skill of delaying gratification, therefore changing the trajectory of these kids' lives. If we can teach them to do that, then they will have all the benefits of, not dropping out of school, finishing high school, going to college, having happy relationships, that kind of thing.
Now, working with language and memory with children is obviously important in their development. Toddlers can repeat, even several months later, actions they have seen only once or twice. And we all know memory improves with practice. So what are some helpful hints that you can give to parents on working with children in terms of their language development and in terms of their memory?
Okay. So what I want to share first is some of the data that's very interesting. So number one is we know that kids in poverty have heard 30 million less words by the time they're 3 years old than children of middle class or above. So if you think about that's 30 million less words they've heard that have gone into their body. So then, therefore, by age 3, a middle class child is able to say about 1,100 words. A child in poverty only knows about 600 words. If we take that by hour, it's really amazing that kids in poverty hear about 500 words per hour, and kids in middle class have heard about 1,200 words an hour. So that's really important. So the first major thing is talking to kids. So then since then, we have discovered that it's not just the number of the words, but it's kind of about the language. So number one, children learn what they hear most. So if they hear a lot of vocabulary words and conversation, they will learn that. If they hear a lot of yelling and screaming, they'll hear that. If they hear a lot of curse words, they'll hear that. Or if they don't hear anything, then their brain is not even being stimulated at all. Number two, what we do know is that children learn words for things and events that interest them. So we used to believe that if you were walking your child and you saw a plane up in the sky, you would say, "Look, a plane, look, a plane." What we found out since is that if the kids say, "What's that?" or they point to something and you tell them, they're more likely to remember the words because they've asked for it and they're interested in that. And it makes sense that as an adult, we really only remember the stuff that we care about, and we don't remember the stuff that we don't care about. Number three is that interactions and responsive environments build language learning. What we now call that is serve and return. So not just talking at kids works. What you need to do, it needs to be an interaction. You talk at kids, and then they say something, and then we talk back at them. Now, when kids are little, we'll say something, and they'll coo back, or they'll smile, or they'll giggle. That counts as interacting. So we want both parties to be able to give.
Thank you so much for all of that information, Ellen. And our time has just run out, and there's so much more I know we can talk about. But if you would like more information on a lot of these topics, Ellen is affiliated with the Upside Down organization in Baltimore. You can get information from them on their website at www.upsidedownorganization.org. Thank you so much, Ellen.
This has been truly fascinating. Thank you, Ellen, so much.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
That's our program for today. We'll be back in 2 weeks at the same time. In the meantime, you can go online to learn more at papromiseforchildren.com. For John Posa and the Northwest Regional Key Program for Quality Early Learning, I'm Joe Taylor. Thank you for listening, and have a great day. Have a great day.